Well, good morning, friends. Good to see all the visiting and handshakes. It's wonderful. Welcome to Lakeview. If you're new with us, my name is Paul, and I have the honor and privilege to be the lead pastor here at Lakeview. I was going to say this, but I think I'll just be honest because I'm going to miss out the best part that I really enjoy about our time together is that after the service, I get a chance to walk around, give out some candies to kids, which may sound weird, but it's just mostly to be welcoming. They have no reason to talk to me, so it's like, hey, here's some candy. But I'm going to miss it out today because I'm not feeling great, so I'm trying to keep some distance from people. And so I'm just sharing that to say, if you don't see me in the lobby after the service, that's why. And I'm just sad to miss that part because I really enjoy hearing the stories and hearing all the things that are happening in your lives as we visit, as we connect, and as we get to know one another. So I will miss that. But I'm so glad you are here, and I'm so glad you get a chance to visit with one another after the service, and maybe even invite somebody over for lunch. No pressure. All right. Well, one of the things that Jessica and I enjoy as a couple is watching movies and shows, likely like many of you. And Jessica in particular is really, really, really good at finding a show or a movie with a variety of complexity and nuance and good storytelling that she knows that we both will enjoy. Like she just knows this is a great show. I can't start watching it because I know Paul and I will both really like this. She's very thoughtful that way to find stories that connect with both of us that we just really can get into and kind of hear a news story. And I love this about her gift. My problem is that typically the movies and shows become a time where I have an opportunity to sit down, to relax and be comfortable and fall asleep. Something about not planning anything, not preparing anything, not, getting ready for something else just relaxes me, and I'm comfortable, and I'm with my lovely wife, and I just fall asleep, which has a few issues, as you can imagine. Now, one of the issues is that the shows or the movies that Jessica has found for us or picked for us are actually really, really good. They're often really, she's right, this is the shows that I would enjoy. So when I do wake up, don't get ahead of me. When I do wake up midway through the show and begin to get into it, I find myself lost because I don't know the backstory. I don't know what's happening. Characters pop up on the screen that I've never seen before. Plans are being discussed that I have no idea what's happening or why they're talking about them. A character shows up and looks at a person a certain way, and I'm like, whoa, why did they do that? And what happens is I begin to bombard Jessica with a flood of questions. Like, who's that? Why did they say that? Why is she looking at him like that? I'm just a joy to watch shows with. And of course, this turns into a real test of patience, like a serious, stress test on resilience of our marriage. And I'm pushing my very good, gracious wife to her limits, but she's far too kind to say what's probably really on her mind. And just reminds me, she's, just stop talking and watch. You'll catch up. You'll get it. You'll get it. Now, I don't know if you found yourself in similar situations where you kind of found yourself halfway into a story, halfway into a podcast, halfway into a movie. Maybe there's a trilogy or kind of like many movies in a row, and you kind of joined in halfway or into a third movie, and you're like, wait a minute, what's happening here? You just feel lost. You're trying to connect the dots and the meaning of it all. And if it's happened to you, you find very quickly that what is going on is just you're really lacking the backstory. You just don't know how to make sense of the characters and what they're doing because you don't know the backstory. Now, the reason I tell this funny story about me sleeping is that something similar like that can happen in church. Hopefully not sleeping part, although it could. But something like this happens in church as well. We hear a lot about Jesus when we come to church. And we learn that he's the center of the story, that he's the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the main character, and we talk about him all the time, and this is good. Our lives, our hopes, our faith hinges on Jesus. This understanding is crucial. Centering our faith on Jesus is exactly what we should do. But can I suggest, if we don't understand the backstory to Jesus, if we don't understand the full story, if we just jump in halfway, having to either overlook or try to catch up with things, we might find ourselves confused to what Jesus is actually talking about. We find ourselves thinking, why does he keep talking about the Old Testament so much? Why is he bringing up the temple? What's with the water? What does he mean he's the bread of life? And we hear all these things Jesus starts talking about, and we don't know sometimes what to do with it. And we don't want to seem, if we're new to faith, we don't want to seem, maybe I should know this. Maybe everybody else seems to be nodding along. They must know what this means. And we find ourselves confused, uncertain, and sometimes even doubtful because we just don't have that backstory. And when we don't have the backstory, we can actually take a variety of postures, and these postures could look like ignoring some of the parts that seem irrelevant to us. We might think, well, that doesn't, okay, Jesus, the temple, you're going to restore it in a few days. What does that mean? That doesn't really apply to me. And so we focus only what feels familiar or comfortable. We begin maybe also take a posture where we begin to assume or fill in the gaps. When things don't fully make sense, we might start making assumptions. And instead of wrestling with the complexity to fill in the blanks and look back into the story, we begin to think, maybe this is why he's doing it. And we fill it in on our own. And sometimes that filling the gap can be a little bit inaccurate, or maybe a lot inaccurate. Or sometimes we take a posture and begin to align ourselves incorrectly. We may take something out of context and fit our own understanding, shape it to match our own current worldview. We maybe begin to align something Jesus says to politics, to economics, to relationships. And it may be helpful there. But if that's not what Jesus is talking about, we begin to force and align something that wasn't meant or intended to be aligned. And maybe at its worst, we begin to proclaim something without fully understanding it. Maybe we begin to speak and say things we don't fully understand and claim them to be deep truths when they might not actually be. Now that sounds a little scary, doesn't it? And I don't want to scare us because Jesus is good and he's gracious, and for sure he's the center and the main character who invites us into the story, and we do catch up and we do learn, and it's okay. This is not like some kind of browbeating. It's simply just saying it's so much easier to misunderstand when we don't have the backstory. This is why I'm convinced for us to fully appreciate and to understand the story of God, to fully understand Jesus, his life, his teaching, and the work, we need to know the full story. We need to know the backstory. And to help us understand the backstory, today we're starting a brand new series, The Torah. The Torah. Now, I don't know if you've heard of this word before. Maybe if you're a longtime churchgoer, maybe you kind of heard it. Maybe you've heard it explained. Maybe you know exactly what it is. But the Torah is what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on the story of God and start right in the beginning. And the Torah itself holds a few definitions and meanings. The Torah most often refers to the first 5 books of the Bible. First 5 books of the Bible. That's often what Torah is referring to, is these first 5 books. Books of Moses, the first 5 books. Torah itself, the word Torah, could also mean instruction, teaching. So it holds few different meanings. Sometimes Torah is also explained as the Pentateuch. Maybe you've heard this churchy word, the Pentateuch, this theological word. Now, penta literally means 5, right? Penta, 5. 5 teuchs. 5 teuchs. Now, if you're wondering what a teuch is, it's not a thing you wear. Well, different. 5 teuchs. Teuchs literally means scrolls. 5 books. So it's just naming the obvious. It simply means 5 scrolls, 5 books. And so the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, teaching and instructions on God, on the world, and for the people. And what we learn very quickly as Jesus followers is that these first 5 foundational books are extremely important because they introduce the core and foundational story. And then they introduce the plot conflict and the promise that Jesus sees himself as contributing to and bringing to fulfillment. So the Torah is really important because it gives us the foundational story, the core story. And if we don't know the core story and the plot conflict and the promise, we can't actually fully appreciate what Jesus is doing. So to help us to fully engage with the God story, we're going to start from the beginning today. As we journey through the Torah this fall, we're gonna really locate ourselves in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We're gonna go through the first 5 books. And I want, as we do that, as we go through the Torah, I want us to each keep this one idea in front of us. So it's gonna be a very personal idea. I'm gonna put it on the screen right away. So if you're a note taker, you can jot this idea down, because I want you to kind of have this idea in front of you as we journey through the Torah. If you're not a note taker, you can just take a picture of the slide too. They'll help you remember it. But this idea is this, as we go through the Torah. If I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. If I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. And that story unfolds in the first 5 books of the Bible, in the Torah. So as we unpack, as we look, as we journey through it, when we encounter tricky or confusing parts, the sections we might be tempted to skip over, assume about, dismiss, or ignore, we need to remember that Jesus sees those parts as contributing to his story, leading to the fulfillment that he brings. So what I want to suggest is that these 5 books, they illuminate actually who Jesus is. They tell a story without which we can't truly grasp all the significant things Jesus is saying, doing, and accomplishing. They help us. They help us. So, if I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. Now, one more thing before we just dive right in. To help us, there's a great resource. It's a book called The God Story by Alan Emerson and Adam Cox. And the book is available in our bookstore. It's going to help us throughout the whole year as we journey through God's story. It's easy read. It uses pastoral language to help us kind of navigate the story. So if you like having resources to read along as we kind of journey through the Torah, and then as we journey later on in the year through who's Jesus and the church, this will be a great resource for you. So do check it out. It's in the bookstore. I highly encourage it. It's a great book. I've read it a couple of times, and it's just a helpful guide for us. So that's the God Story, and it is in our bookstore. All right, the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible. Now, the first of these 5 books is Genesis, the beginning. The beginning. Now, Genesis can be broken down into 2 parts. There's different ways to slice it and dice it, but in 2 parts of the 2 themes, they're kind of held with a hinge in between. And the first is Genesis 1 to 11. It would kind of be the first part, which deals with God and the whole world. And that is what we're going to look at today. That's right. In 20 minutes, we're going to figure out God and the whole world. That's why you need resources and books and all that kind of good stuff. And your home church, where you can talk about all this. And then next week, we're going to talk about the second part, which is Genesis 12 to 50, which is God and Abraham's family. So God and the whole world is the first part, and then God and Abraham's family, which we'll look at next week. Now, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Then he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day and darkness night, and evening passed and morning came, marking the first day. We begin our journey to the story of God with this dramatic poetry that reveals God as the creator of all things. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the verses continue as God begins to form and put the earth together. And he's forming it, and it's taking shape, and there's beauty that's happening as you read this poetry. I love poetry because it can hold so much truth in it, right? It's beautiful, and it's unwinding, and God is putting together all these beautiful things. And then we arrive in this pivotal moment of creation in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." This is a pivotal moment, the moment we read that God does something significantly different from the rest of the good creation. God creates humanity. He creates us, each person here. And it's pivotal and important because he creates humanity in his image, unlike the rest of creation. He creates us to reign, to rule over the rest of all the things he has created. He says to the people, "Reign with me." And we learn here, right in this pivotal verse, in verse 26, that we are the image of God. The image of God. Now, the Hebrew word for here is tselem. Tselem, the image of God, tselem, which often is used for statue or idol. God says, let us create a statue, an idol of us. Which should make us ask a question. What does it mean to be a statue or idol of God? What does that mean? Let's read that first part again. Let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign. This is significant. God is saying to be Tselem, to be my image, to be the statue, to be this idol, to be my image in the world is to be ruling and co-ruling with me. This is a foundational and core idea of the scriptures. Right in the beginning, right in this first chapter, we have this core foundational idea. The idea the Bible will be addressing over and over and over throughout all the 66 books. Idea that Jesus will take upon himself. Tselem, image, statue of God. These image bearers, these little physical representatives are representing and serving alongside the Creator, the one who has created all things. Meaning, if God's will and rule is going to happen here on earth, God is willing, choosing to have his rule and will be accomplished in the world through these creatures, through us. I mean, the idea is actually incredible if you think about it. If you just pause in this pivotal passage, it's pivotal that God is saying, all things, my will be done through these people working, co-ruling with me. God has created and invited this humanity to take all the raw potential in this incredible planet Earth and invites them to assert their will over it in a way that will make Earth flourish even more. This is so foundational. And we have to root ourselves in this part of the story because this is something that this is the theme that underlies the rest of the scriptures. Consider what it means when we read about God in the Bible, right? I think many of us read the Bible and our view of God is that his will is the only will that's done in the world. Well, that's not fully wrong. His will is going to be done in this world. But having this crucial backstory, we read from the beginning that God's rule, his kingdom, his will is established how? How is it going to be established here on earth according to verse 26? Through whom is it going to be done? Through his image bearers, through human beings. See how incredible that is? A practical implication is anytime we say, why didn't God? Why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do that? I think this narrative is forcing us to think about, why didn't I? Why didn't you? According to Genesis 1, he's commissioned human beings to be the ones to effect his will in the world with him. With him. So the real question bounces back to me and to you, which is significant to think about as we remember, if I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. This same bouncing back to us and our participation in God's will shows up with Jesus, doesn't it? We see it when he's questioned, when he's interrogated about his life and ministry. And as he's questioned about his teaching or behavior, or as he's questioned about other people's behavior, what does he do? He turns it around. He brings it back to the backstory. Whenever people were projecting their expectations or frustrations or demands onto him or onto somebody else, he, with this backstory, says, well, what are you doing about it? What's the state of your heart? How are you contributing to the flourishing of all things? How are you participating in the will of God? How are you loving your neighbors? Are you partnering with God in what God is doing, or are you creating more pain and chaos? Jesus is reminding the religious and irreligious of their foundational calling, co-rulers, executors of God's will here in the world. He turns it on religious leaders. How are you loving your neighbors? Second greatest commandment. And he's not just being clever. He's not just being, oh wow, Jesus really knew the Bible. I mean, he did. But he's not just being clever for the clever's sake. No, he's doing that because this was the intention for people. You were to be co-creators. You were to be participants and executors of God's will on earth. You were supposed to help this place flourish. All the potential, all the good, you were to participate in it. He's reminding us and those that were confronting him and of this backstory. A story that not only speaks of the intended purposes of people, but also of the commissioned purposes, right? We read 2 verses later. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all the animals that scurry along the ground. God invites them to co-reign, and then God blesses the process. Bring out the potential. Be fruitful. Increase. Key theme here, right here, is the image of bless, and it's linked to the blessing and commission of God to all humanity. Go, have the earth, flourish, have a great time, make neighborhoods, music, art, gardens, do good. This is the setting stage. There's a sense in which anybody who would read this immediately would see that it doesn't matter who you are, where you live, what millennia you were born in. The story is wrapping its arms around all of the universal history right here. God has created humanity for the good of the world, as he is also good for the world. This is the commissioning. This is the calling. This is the thing we're rooted in. This is what Jesus keeps trying to bring people back to. You are an image bearer of God. And then there's plot twist. All right away. In the first few chapters, we read, chapter 3. Then serpent was shrewdest of all the wild animals the Lord God has made, created creature. One day he asked the woman, did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden? Of course we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, the woman replied. It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. God said you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die. You will not die, the serpent replied to the woman. God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you'll be like God, knowing both good and evil. This is a familiar passage of the fall, of the rebellion, of the problem, of the plot twist for many of us that grew up in the church or are Bible readers. So familiar that sometimes as Bible readers, we just go through it quickly. We're like, we don't know what to do with all the serpent language sometimes. We don't know what to do with the fruit and the tree, and we just read through it quickly. But let's look at verse 5 again. The serpent says, God knows that your eyes will be open as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God. Now let's just stop right there. Let's pause in that verse. If you have been part of church for a long time, you have read or heard this many, many times. But even though you have, let's not get past it too quickly. Do you see what actually is happening here? What's the problem with this temptation? What's the actual deception here? The serpent says, we read it, you'll be like God. If you do this, you'll be like God. What's the problem with this? Well, the problem that we miss sometimes when we read this or hear this deception is, according to Genesis 1:26 that we just unpacked, humanity in this moment is already like God. Humanity is already Tselem. They're already the image, the statue, the idol of God. They're already like God in all possible ways we can imagine or dream of. We are his image. We already are like God in this moment. Invited us co-creators, partners to do his will. Now, because we live on this side of the plot twist, we think that the deception is that humanity is like, well, I'm not like God and I want to be like God. That makes sense. That makes sense why they would do that. Because we forget. We forget. And that's the deception. We forget the image that we bear. So we root ourselves in the deception of like, yeah, that's a pretty tempting thing to be like God. But 126 already tells us we are. We forget the incredible royal invitation and reality we already have. So the deception for Adam and Eve isn't that they're not like God. The deception lies in this question. Will they trust God's definition of good and evil? Or will they take the fruit and choose to define good and evil on their own terms? God gives humanity a moral choice in the creation story. Will they trust that God says, what I have planned for this world, for you to work with me, to flourish it is good? Will they trust that? They're given a choice. building God's new world as he has invited them to, or to do it on their own terms? Will they trust God's definition of good and evil, or will they take the fruit and define good and evil on their own terms? If we keep reading the story, we know they fail. They choose to decide for themselves. They choose to say, I may have a better way to do God's will in this world. I have a better way to do my will in this world. And the theme continues through the entire story. And the same question, will you trust God for what is good and evil, is asked over and over and over. Do we trust God on his terms? Or do we want to do it on our own terms? How will we handle the moral choice of the creation story? The story takes off from here as people continue to rule and reign by their own terms, creating chaos, more often than not by defining what we think is good and evil. And there's a spiraling of humanity right in the first 11 chapters. Just incredible spiraling that you're like, how did we go from this to murder like within few pages? The entire first part of Genesis in these first 11 chapters is rooted in this backstory. Did you trust that you're the image, that you're Tselem, that you're the image of God? Or will you seize power and do things by your own will? Human beings, we seize the fruit. This is the backstory that Jesus arrives to restore and set right. Both remind us that we are God's children and that we can now return through him to our royal birthright. If I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. Jesus shows up with this backstory, reminding, redeeming, renewing our image in God. So the family language of children, father, parent God, is all a creator God, is all about redeeming us back to that high calling of carrying his image. Bringing us back to what was intended, what was true, and the deception muddled. Jesus comes back saying, come back, turn, repent. That's the language there. Repent, come back to me, turn. You're seizing power, you're making wars, you're controlling, you're enslaving, you're hurting one another, ruling through chaos, which was never the plan. You're misusing the power given to you by wrongly defining what is good and evil. So here's what it looks like, Jesus says. Jesus shows up and embodies this backstory. More than that, he allows the evil and these misinterpretations of good and evil to put him on the cross. He dies and he comes back to life, offering us a path, defeating death, offering us a path back to being image of God. Jesus lives into the story by renewing our image through and in himself, saying, follow me. In fact, the greatest sermon ever told, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reminds us of this backstory, doesn't he? In Matthew 5:17, he says, don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish it. Look what he's saying here. Don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the Torah. I know the backstory. I know what happened. No, I have come to accomplish its purposes, to bring you back to be the image bearer of God. The Torah begins with the backstory of God creating humanity, creating us to partner in orchestrating his will to allow all the good potential to flourish, to step into this life and to contribute to the flourishing of this world, to trust God in his definitions of good and evil, to trust him what flourishing looks like. And when we show mistrust, when we take the fruit, when we seize power, when we choose to do what's right for me, doesn't matter what I do, as long as it's good for me. When we begin to live on our own terms, God's response is grief. We read through the Genesis account, God's response is grief about this downward spiral of humanity's sin. It's grief. And his response to this downward spiral is this grace-filled story culminating in Jesus, whose life and teaching is the renewal of the image we are given. His love for us is that big. So big, in fact, that he suffers, as I said. He suffers on the cross so we could have life, fully being able to live out of our image. So friends, we come together on Sundays. We come together at our home churches. We gather to remember to thank, to worship, to be renewed into who we were always meant to be. We gather because God created us to be co-creators, to help this place flourish. So we gather because it's good to be reminded and not to be swayed by the spiral or the chaos or the ideas of what being in power looks like. No, we redeem the power that God wants for us. His love is that big. The backstory is that God created the heavens and the earth. And then in a pivotal moment, he created us and said, you are my image. Will you co-rule with me? Will you do good in this world?